within the log file. It's always login.live.com, which is the main site. When you go to live.com and want to log in, all data, so all authentication is handled by this specific URL. Then we see here in yellow a few interesting things. So the BHO basically reports that it has logged some keys, it has read out some keys. I've obfuscated this a bit in order to not reveal too much information about the victim, but we see that the user entered some kind of login, and as a login it was an email address, and then he used the password, which seems to be rather strong. So it has digits, it has uppercase and also lowercase characters, so it seems to be a rather strong password. And then in the third request, we see everything in clear text again, so the login and the password. So the BHO has basically observed that the victim went to login.live.com, the victim tried to log in, the BHO had access to the whole DOM tree, was able to read everything what the victim entered, and then this information was sent to the drop zone, and the attacker has basically all information that's needed to impersonate as this particular victim. Other information that's read out by NetHell is, for example, the protected storage. So each time you go to a website and have this autosave feature, so if the browser basically stores the information you entered, so that next time you visit the website, it's basically read out of some kind of internal cache. This is actually the protected storage. So NetHell has the possibility to also read the protected storage. So, for example, if you store the authentication credentials for your banking account within IE, those can be read out. If you store your passwords within Outlook, those can be read out and all these kind of things. So autocomplete password is the other example where the attacker also gets the information about another live.com account. And the third type of information that's typically stolen are cookies. So the BHO also reads out all cookies that are stored on your local disk and also transmits them to the victim, since there are also several websites that do cookie-based authentication, so they also steal cookies. Some versions of NetHell also have the possibility to steal certificates, or they also have the possibility to defeat visual keyboards. So if you do not enter your credentials via the keyboard, since you hear keyloggers, but then you have some kind of visual keyboard where you just click with your mouse the information that should be entered. Basically what they do is they just take a screenshot around your mouse click and then send this screenshot to the drop zone so that they can also observe what you clicked. So basically, they own you in different ways. So this was NetHell. It was a rather simple one, so it's just a BHO, probably just a few thousand lines of code, not too advanced. Even on MSDN you find basically the code needed to start a BHO, so it's not that hard to basically get started in this area. NetHell is, from a technical point of view, not that advanced. But more advanced is Zeus, our second example. Actually, up to now, the first version actually used this VSN POEM directory within Windows System 32, and therefore another name for this is WSN POEM, and ZBot is the name given by several virus vendors. So actually up to now there are 3 different versions out there. It's very characteristic for each version. They use a different file name for the main executable. So NTOS.exe was the first version. Then we have OEM BIOS.exe, which was the second. And recently, so a couple of months ago actually, they used this Trex.exe. So those are the 3 main lines of this particular malware. Furthermore, it drops several other files within System 32. For example, NTOS.exe also drops audio and video DLL. So it's pretty characteristic. So once you see an infected system, it's pretty easy to spot the actual infection steps. So what Zeus does is they do not implement the BHO, so they do not inject, they do not append to Internet Explorer, but what they do is they inject themselves into several system processes within the Windows environment. For example, they inject themselves into services.exe and some other system processes so that they can then observe everything what's handled by those processes. They have some interesting features. For example, they also implement some kind of form crabbing. So each time you go on a website, they also pass the DOM tree and basically identify each form field within the HTML document and then read out this form field, transmit it to the drop zone. They can also inject arbitrary HTML code. So for example, what's quite popular is for a banking website, they inject additional HTML code so that new form fields are seen by the victim that ask, for example, transaction numbers or other things. Or they inject other forms, for example, to ask for a social security number, for a credit card number, also in arbitrary websites. Probably the interesting thing I heard in this area was one victim which was also infected with Zeus, where the attackers injected 10 additional fields which asked for TAN numbers. And then the victim received several mails each on a particular day. And then in the afternoon, he called his bank and said, "I'm out of 10 numbers, please send me more." because he entered so many. But probably these are the kind of people that we cannot protect at any kind of time. Zeus also has the possibility to steal certificates, so they have a similar feature set as also NetHel, but from a technical point of view it's more interesting since it injects into all processes that are available and then reads out from them the interesting information. Another interesting feature is also HTML parsing. So for several banking websites, they have also implemented that once the victim logs in, they can also parse the HTML code and extract information about the balance of the bank account. And this information about the balance is then also sent to the drop zone so that the attacker can easily see which bank account is interesting and which not. Within the log files, which I'll talk later about, we found, for example, 25 victims that were infected this way, and in total they had more than $120,000 on their accounts. So it seems like an attacker can have access to quite a bit of money there. Some other characteristics is that they use a very characteristic mutex name. It's always __ system __ and then some other numbers. So this is a rather generic way and to also detect Zeus. Probably the best overview of how to analyze Zeus is available in a paper by Frank Boldewijn, reconstructor.org, where he basically showed with complete source code of how Zeus can be unpacked, of how it can be analyzed, and it's available at his website. Again, we get somehow access to the log files, and this is an example of how the log files from Zeus look like. In the first line, it's just a version number, so each build basically has a new version number. We see the system time, so it's middle of June 2008. The victim is logged in since 5 minutes, so it's just connected to the internet. The version number is Windows, so it's XP, Service Pack 2. Language 1033 is, I think, US. So it has an English user interface. And then we see Zeus is injected into IE Explorer Excel, so within Internet Explorer. And in this case, it observed a login to Wachovia, so one of the major banks within the US. We see again that the keystrokes are locked. So all keystrokes, the victim types are basically locked and sent to the drop zone. And in the lower part, we also see that the user ID and the password are also correct. So this is basically stolen bank accounts. So a complete Wachovia account is stolen in this case. Other type of information extracted by NetHel, is again the protected storage. So in this case, we see Zeus is injected into services.exe, and from there it reads out the protected storage. For example, username and password for Comcast and an AOL account. So if you compare this to phishing, where the attacker can only basically get one credential from one site, with a keylogger, he can get lots of credentials just from the protected storage or from the browsing behavior of the victim. And the third type of information stolen by Zeus are, again, cookies. So they also read out all cookies and send this information to the drop zone. So these are basically the two main families of malware that we analyzed as part of the study, but there are many others out there. Just to mention a few, Torpig, Xenovar, and MapRoot are probably one of the most advanced malware binaries we currently see in the wild. What this malware, for example, does is it modifies the MBR, so in order to also stay or to be loaded early on during the boot process. They also have some other interesting tricks, and they also have the possibility to lock banking websites. So each time when you're infected, go to a banking website, probably your credentials are stolen. And since I think a week or so, Torpig is also active again, so they were gone for several weeks, but since about 1 week they are active again and spreading their malware. Then Banker or Bankos, it's pretty popular within South America, so there are many different families or many different versions within Brazil. What they do is, from the feature point of view, they have not as many features as Zeus and NetHell, but it's nevertheless effective, especially since there are so many different versions out there. What they do is they send the credentials via email back to the attacker. So they don't use a drop zone, but send all stolen information via email out. Silent Bank is another one. Or recently, an antivirus company detected what they termed Chrome Inject. Basically, it was a Firefox plugin. So it was a plugin for Firefox, which was supposed to also log keystrokes to banking websites. So it had also a config URL or config file in which several banking websites were referenced. During a workshop recently, we also analyzed Chrome Inject, but it seems like the sample is actually broken, so it doesn't work in the wild, actually. But now it also makes sense. Since Firefox is getting more and more market share, it also makes sense to target Firefox and not only IE. Okay, so this was an overview of different kinds of keyloggers that are out there. We covered, I think, 6 or so, 2 of them in more detail, 4 more briefly, but there are also many others out there. So the threat is real, and there are many of these malware families that basically try to get your credentials just via logging keystrokes. So basically the start of our research was then, how can we find the drop zones in an automated way, and how can we learn more about what they are doing? So to come back to the initial slide, this is how the banking malware works from a technical point of view. So the attacker sends the keylogger to the victim. This can be by email, as we've seen during the motivation. It can be via drive-by downloads. So these are malicious websites. And if you go to such a website and your browser is not patched to the latest patch level, then the website basically attacks your browser, and via the vulnerability within your browser, they install malware on your system. And then basically the keylogger infects the victim's machine, observes the credentials, and sends them to the drop zone, as we've seen during the examples. So what we now do is we use the concept of so-called honeypots, in which we basically have systems that are deliberately vulnerable. So we pretend to be a victim, but we have especially prepared systems with which we basically attract malicious traffic to our honeypot. And this is a system that can be compromised since we closely monitor it and then observe what the attacker is doing with the system that we control. You can think of it as some kind of basically closely monitored systems which we infect with the keylogger and then monitor what's happening there. Last year we also published a book in this area in which we basically talk more about different kinds of honeypots. It's called Virtual Honeypots. If you're interested, just get the book. Okay, so with honeypots, in the first phase we use them in order to collect samples. So we want to get the target of attacks, so we want to get infected, we want to attract keyloggers, and we use different types of honeypots. On the one hand, we use so-called client-side honeypots. Basically, you can think of them as being a machine that has a vulnerable version of Internet Explorer, Probably also some plugins are installed that are vulnerable. So, for example, an older version of the Acrobat plugin or some other